Several California cities and counties have contracted with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, to house detainees, including unaccompanied children, in privately operated detention centers. How much is this costing local jurisdictions, and what oversight, if any, is occurring? We'll ask Elaine Howle, California State Auditor, and Dan Morain with CalMatters.
BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. California and the Trump administration have been at odds over immigration policy. One point of contention is occurring at California's immigration detention centers. Our guest is Dan Morain, editor of What Matters from CalMatters, which is a summary of state politics. Very good. I think it's fantastic. I hope people do sign up for it. But welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
A little plug there for you.
Me. Absolutely.
So recently you noted that just as the legislature was considering some bills that, quote, would toss a monkey wrench into Trump's immigration policy, unquote, a Kaiser Health News report raised questions about California's largest detention center. What did they find?
Well, it's so interesting because, you know, the federal government has inspected these ICE facilities in the past and found not too many problems. Yeah. Kaiser looked at some Inspector General reports on these same facilities and found significant problems. Yeah. So these are, you know, people too long in solitary, not enough mental health care. All the problems you find in prisons, they found in these state detention.
Entirely surprising.
Yeah.
You know, you noted that the legislatures responded with some bills aimed at battling the Trump administration's immigration policy, most notably AB 32 regarding private or for-profit prisons. What's being proposed?
Well, the proposal is to prohibit private prisons in California. So this would be
pretty sweeping.
This would prohibit the state from contracting with private prisons. It also would prohibit the federal government from operating private prisons or contracting with private prisons in California. I'm not sure that that's legal, but that's what the proposal is, and it's a bill that's pending on Gavin Newsom's desk right now.
Yeah, there's not a lot of prisoners in private prisons. I think I read that 4,000 prisoners in private prisons, but the reason for that was the state's situation with the overcrowding in prisons that led to a court decision that said, hey, listen, the state prisons are so overcrowded that you're violating the constitutional rights of the inmates. Is there any concern that that this, if you have a bill like this, that it's going to somehow unnecessarily tie the state's hands when it comes to overcrowding? What happens if overcrowding happens again?
Well, that's exactly the argument of the operators of private prisons and the advocates of private prisons, that these are a necessary escape valve. If California prisons get too crowded, you can put people in private prisons. The California sheriffs are opposed to this bill. And one of the reasons they're opposed to this bill is that it would hamstring them. You know, jails are under a lot of pressure. There was a story in the San Diego Union Tribune this past weekend about all the deaths in San Diego County jails. So there are issues with private prisons and there are issues with publicly operated prisons.
Yeah, it's interesting that since realignment, there's been a shift from state prisons to county jails. By the way, I didn't realize that prisons are only state and county jails are county. But as you move those people from state prisons to county jails, those county jails weren't necessarily set up for those long-term holds.
Not at all. They're set up to hold people pending trial. They're set up to handle people for up to a year, misdemeanors. Now there are people who are doing multiple years in county jails. One of the big problems with county jails is they don't have mental health beds, and so this is an issue. It's an issue in San Diego. It's an issue in Merced. It's an issue in several counties around the state. Is what do you do with the increased number of mentally ill inmates? About 30% of the jail population.
Wow. It's also, I should note that AB 32 does have some exceptions to it, right? One of the exceptions it does talk about is if there's overpopulation, court-ordered way to deal with the population cap in California prisons, and it only lasts until 2028. So
Right.
there is a sunset provision on it.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think? Is the governor going to sign it?
Well, I think that the governor wants to sign it. The governor made really clear in his State of the State speech, State of the State, or maybe his inaugural speech, that that he wanted to end private prisons. So he's sort of obligated. That said, it's complicated, and I think the more one thinks about it, the more complicated it becomes. If you're an ICE detention facility, you're housing people who are facing deportation. Do you want them housed in California near their court, near their family, or do you want them housed in Arizona?
Okay.
And if they're housed in Arizona, how do you get counsel? How do you get attorneys to visit them? It's complicated.
It usually is. I want to thank Dan Morain from CalMatters for being here. Up next, all of this has got the state auditor taking a closer look at the situation. Her findings next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Recently, the state auditor took a close look at local county detention centers that have contracted with the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement to house detainees. The state auditor, Elaine Howle, is our guest and can talk about those findings. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So, we know that immigration is a federal responsibility, but could you give us a little background on the federal immigration system?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people have heard of ICE, and ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they really are responsible for immigration and customs enforcement within the boundaries of the United States.
Okay.
There is the Border Patrol, there's Homeland Security, but ICE, which was the focus of the audit that we did, is really responsible for detaining individuals within the United States.
Okay, so there's something called a Flores Settlement Agreement. Does that impact, and then there's also the Department of Justice talking about a zero tolerance policy that impact family separations. How does that all work together?
Right, so the settlement you're referring to, the Flores settlement, is an agreement that the United States had where we will not, if we have unaccompanied children, so
Okay.
these are children that don't have a parent or a legal guardian associated with them, so they need to be put in an appropriate setting as far as being detained.
That's been in the news a lot lately,
Right.
the problems with that. And then you have the zero tolerance policy by the Department of Justice. How does that impact?
Right, the zero
settlement?
tolerance policy that the Trump administration back in 2018 started enforcing was saying we have zero tolerance, we're going to start detaining all kinds of individuals. And what happened in that situation is children were taken away from their parents because parents and children would not be detained in the same facility. So now you have an increasing number of unaccompanied children because they've been taken away from their parents.
And they've stopped that policy recently. The federal government's
Right.
changed that policy.
Correct.
So how did immigration detention centers work? Those contracts work? Where are they in place, et cetera?
Right. There are a variety of contracts in the state of California. At least there were. Some have been eliminated, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are contracts. ICE has to contract with these detention facilities. But what they did is they contracted with cities and with counties.
Okay.
And the reason they did that is under federal rules, similar to state rules. If you're going to enter into a contract, typically you competitively bid that contract. But if you're contracting with another government entity, a city or a county, you don't have to go through a competitive bidding process. So
Sounds like a workaround.
Exactly. ICE contracted with a city, which then the city would turn around and contract with the private entity.
Okay, so how does the federal government monitor those facilities then?
Well, they don't do a very good job of it.
Okay.
At least when we conducted the audit, we found that ICE does have a responsibility because they are responsible for these individuals who are being detained in these private facilities. So they should be monitoring. Now, there is an Inspector General for Homeland Security that does look at some
They're
of the
using
facilities.
a private company too to monitor as well, right?
Right. ICE actually contracted with a private company to go in and monitor the facilities, look for conditions that are substandard as far as safety, looking for medical conditions, are they getting medical care, appropriate care, those sorts of things. But the inspections were not very well done. The contractor for ICE basically said things look good.
Yeah.
The IG goes in and says, no, there were some serious concerns here in these facilities.
Well, let me ask you this. We've heard a lot about California's opposition to much of what's happening at the federal level, sanctuary cities, for example. Has the state tried to limit immigration detention in California?
Right. Recently, the state of California legislature passed some legislation and enacted some bills that says if you have an existing contract a city or county, you cannot renew that contract, or you certainly cannot enter into new contracts for this particular purpose. So the state of California is really trying to clamp down on this particular situation. In addition, they gave the Attorney General strong authority to go into these facilities and assess the conditions within each of those facilities.
I'm thinking the federal government doesn't like that.
The federal government is not real happy about that, absolutely not.
So there's a conflict then between the state Attorney General and the Department of Justice, Federal Department of Justice?
I think so, but the Department of Justice actually did go in. They had to complete their first report in March of this year, so they did go into some of these facilities last fall and early this year and put out a report to the public and certainly to the legislature and identified some very serious deficiencies in these facilities.
It's interesting because I was reading your report that says that the Board of State and Community Corrections are supposed to establish minimum standards, right? So we've got a state agency.
Right.
We've also got social services is supposed to be involved in inspecting these facilities at least once every 2 years. Is that happening?
Right. Department of Social Services is responsible for inspecting facilities, typically foster homes, because some of these kids are not going to be placed into a detention juvenile justice facility if they don't have any criminal background. They're just a child that's been separated from a parent, and they don't have a legal guardian in the United States. They may end up in a foster home. That's where Social Services has a responsibility to vet foster parents, group homes, those sorts of things, and they should be inspecting those facilities. They don't necessarily do as good a job as they should, but that's what their responsibility is.
Okay, well, up next we're going to take a look at the report's findings and the lack of proper oversight. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a report her office did concerning city and county contracts with ICE concerning detention centers. So your report notes that, quote, essentially the cities act as pass-through entities between ICE and private operators by paying the same amount to the private operators as the cities receive from ICE, unquote. It appears that this may be an attempt for private operators to kind of work around federal procurement rules. Can you explain that whole situation?
Right, as I discussed a little bit earlier. So typically, if you're going to contract with a private entity, a government, state of California, the federal government, you need to go through a competitive bidding process, giving all kinds of vendors the opportunity to bid for that particular project or to provide that service. What ICE did is ICE approached local governments in California and said, we want to enter into a contract with you, and then you will enter into a contract with this specific vendor. And it allowed ICE to circumvent competitive bidding processes. The worst example, and we have an example in the audit report where one of the private companies, GEO is one of the private companies that has a facility, approached the city of Bakersfield and said, we want to contract with you, you contract with ICE, and then you'll get an administrative fee. Bakersfield said not interested, so GEO went to the city of McFarland, even though the facility's in Bakersfield. So it really was a workaround by the private vendor working with ICE to get cities and counties to contract.
You know, I've done work as a federal mediator, so I have to go through that procurement process, and I will tell you, it's quite lengthy and quite rigorous. So I can see why the private operators wanted to see if they get around it somehow.
Right.
I assume the cities were doing this because there was some money to be had.
Right, so there's a significant amount of money that's passed through to the private facilities. Let's use Adelanto. City of Adelanto, for example, we looked at contracts. They had a 5-year window that we looked at as far as contracts. There was passed through to private operators of about $250 million over those 5 years. On an annual basis, Adelanto is getting $1 million, basically just to have a contract with that private operator and just to pass the money from ICE to
And the way they were doing that, right, they'd have an administrative fee,
right,
and then there's a per bed fee, even if anybody, if someone's not even in the bed.
Exactly. That's the private operators are benefiting from that, because if they have 1,000 available beds, only 900 of those beds are filled. They're getting paid for 1,000 beds, and Adelanto, the city of Adelanto, is getting an administrative fee.
Yeah,
$1 million
and
annually.
the same thing was happening with McFarland. They were picking up $35,000 a year. You know, to administer the contract.
Absolutely, that's correct.
So there's some money to be had here. So let me ask you this. Some of the examples of detention standards that cities were required to provide under ICE contracts. I mean, ICE doesn't just contract with the city and say, do whatever you want. They've got standards that the cities have to comply with. What kinds of things are cities supposed to be doing to meet ICE requirements?
Sure. So there are a variety of different things you would expect a facility to provide. First of all, proper food, nutrition, the basic essentials of life. So making sure that they have appropriate nutritional meals. Do they have access to medical care, dental care? Do they have access to attorneys or any legal, providers that would assist those detainees? Are there other programs for prevention of suicide? Because there were circumstances in at least one of the facilities where some suicides occurred, some attempts occurred. So those are the kinds of services that these private facilities should be providing to the detainees. And it's up to the city and certainly up to ICE to make sure that those services are being provided.
Yeah, but what you found in your report was, quote, cities have not exercised appropriate oversight of their contracts with private operators to house detainees. So what did you find?
Right. We found the cities are doing absolutely no monitoring. Again, they're just essentially serving as a pass-through for the money and then collecting their administrative fee. They were not ensuring that the contract terms that they entered into with that private vendor, that private facility, were being met. And in some cases, the contract terms were not very strong. So we didn't think the contracts were great in the first place. But when they did have provisions, the cities were not monitoring at all. They were saying, well, that's up to ICE and the federal government to make sure that these private
So
facilities...
nobody's watching what's going on here?
No, not
Okay.
doing a very good job of it.
Okay, so your report states that there were some, quote, serious health and safety issues at these contracted detention facilities, unquote. Like what?
Well, as we said, and I think the Attorney General, when his staff went into some of the facilities, found, and the Inspector General for the federal government went in and said it was actually a facility that ICE's private vendor was monitoring, said, oh, this facility looks great.
Okay.
The Inspector General for the federal government for Homeland Security goes in and says, there are bed sheets hanging from the windows. There's attempted suicides occurring. Provision of medical care is not sufficient. They're basically drive-by medical. Oh, that person looks okay.
They just walk by and don't
walk
even...
by and see if
That's
the
the
person,
medical examination.
That's the medical examination. So those kinds of services were not being provided, and ICE the vendor that ICE used was not doing a good job. The IG went in, our Attorney General went in and said these facilities are not up to standard.
It sounds like the city managers from your report didn't even know what was going on here.
Right, again, serving as a pass-through, basically just a conduit for the federal government to contract with private facilities and a conduit to get the money to those private facilities.
So up next, what can be done to improve the situation? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a report her office did concerning city and county detention contracts with ICE. So your report notes that, quote, counties incurred costs for housing detainees or unaccompanied children that exceeded federal payments, unquote. What exactly did you find?
Right, so this was a concern that members of the legislature that asked for the audit were concerned that either state money or local money was being used to pay for these detentions, detention facilities to house detainees. And what we found, for example, Orange County, and as we talked earlier, it's a per diem rate. Well, Orange County never went back and reassessed what their overall costs are to detain an individual, and their costs had increased. So they were using a per diem rate that was old, so they basically were using Orange County budget money to subsidize.
Right, so some cities were actually making money, but some counties, because they hadn't really done a good job of seeing what exactly the costs were actually being underpaid by the federal government. That's coming out of the county general fund.
That's exactly right. So other services in that particular county are suffering because, and in Orange County it was 1.7 million we identified. Contra Costa County, another county that had a contract, didn't include all of the costs. They didn't include medical costs in their per diem rate, which it could be a tremendous expense. So the counties, as you said, were not recouping all of their costs from the federal government for detaining these individuals.
Yeah, you're saying that some counties have not adequately monitored the financial impact of the ICE contracts, and one of them was, the example you gave was one city, I can't remember where it was, might have been Orange County, I'm sorry, county, it might have been Orange County. I think you said that they were charging $118 a day.
Correct.
And the actual cost was actually $6 more a day. And that adds up, and lots of beds, lots of detainees, that money adds up fast, and they're at 1.7 million.
That's absolutely right. Orange County, yes, their per diem rate, they needed to adjust it and they did not, and therefore they basically subsidized.
And it was also, you said Contra Costa County, I think it was $3.4 million, was they neglected to include medical costs? That seems like to be a pretty big thing to forget.
Exactly.
Particularly because under those contracts you're supposed to provide adequate medical care.
That's exactly right. So they did not make sure that their per diem rate that they were charging the federal government reflected all of their costs. And as you said, medical costs can be significant. If you
Any
don't include
employer
that,
knows that for sure, right?
Exactly.
And they also, you're finding in Yolo County, one of the counties had 80% of their funding was from accounts on employee salaries and benefits. So they were spending it on other things, it sounds like.
Right.
So let me ask you this. What would you like to see cities let's talk about cities for a second. When cities contract with ICE, what would you like to see them do in terms of oversight practices, et cetera?
Right. So the cities need to make sure, first of all, if they do contract with these private sector facilities, make sure their contract language is strong, that the language does include all of the requirements, providing nutritional food, providing appropriate medical care, counseling for suicide prevention, legal access to legal services. Make sure those contracts are very strong as far as terminology, and then follow up to make sure that these vendors are actually providing those services. Do some type of monitoring, or if the federal government is doing the monitoring, look at those federal reports that are coming out, and if things aren't getting fixed, because one of the problems we found is some of the deficiencies were identified by NIG, but there's no follow-up to make sure the deficiencies are corrected.
Yeah, you've got to have that feedback loop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the cities need to be doing more if they intend to continue having these kinds of
And the counties
contracts.
too. I mean, they should be making sure that what they're charging is enough to cover their expenses.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes.
So there's also the state legislature. What would you like to see them consider in terms of addressing this issue?
Well, we made recommendations to the cities and counties, certainly, and we made similar recommendations to the legislature to modify state law to make sure that these federal inspections are occurring, that if these contracts continue, there's quarterly reporting, there's a quality control plan, there's adequate follow-up to make sure that deficiencies that have been identified are corrected. So really strengthening, and by putting it in state law, that this monitoring needs to happen. And these facilities, if they are going to continue to house detainees in California, need to be providing appropriate services to those individuals.
And so, and also when you're talking about detainees, right now they're not doing detaining unaccompanied children. That thing has been addressed, but that could come back. That's an issue the state has to consider. The other thing, you said frequency of inspections too. It's the number of times they're inspecting.
Right, and
issue.
we talk about quarterly reporting, periodic inspections, quarterly inspections of some of these facilities, certainly conducting follow-up. So you inspect a facility and you've got to give that facility some time to fix the problem, but you need to go back so that that facility knows, okay, they identified a deficiency, they're going to be back in 6 months, so we need to get this fixed, rather than they're never going to come back.
Just
so
out of curiosity, and you don't have to answer the question if it's too far out there, but do you think these detention facilities run by counties are going to continue? Or are we going to see them going to kind of go by the wayside
I
over
think
time?
some of the counties have already decided to cancel their contracts. I mean, Sacramento County, Contra Costa County, some of the cities have decided it's not worth it.
Right.
So we're no longer going to continue. When these contracts expire, we're done. We're not going to be in this business anymore.
I guess we'll see. Well, I want to thank
Right.
State Auditor Elaine Howle for joining us. Also, Dan Morain from CalMatters. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.